guy rolls into a bar. He's not a skateboarder or a roller skater or on a stretcher. Okay, wait, let me try again. A guy on a wheelchair rolls into a bar and the bartender says, "Sorry, buddy, we don't let people drink and drive." Yeah, okay, terrible joke. You guys have to work with me here. I'm trying to construct a classic joke with a disabled protagonist, which I can do because I choose to use my own disability and the disability of other fictional characters for the greater good, which is universal laughter, or at least a smile. Do you even know how tough it is to visualize a guy on a wheelchair rolling into a bar? For most of the folk in Mumbai, where I'm from, a guy on a wheelchair sighting is usually preceded by copious drinking and then mistaking the cashier on his or her office chair as a wheelchair user. So for my joke, our joke about a guy on a wheelchair rolling into a bar in Mumbai, we must ensure the bar is accessible. In 4 decades of rolling around, having personally experienced living, breathing, eating, drinking, traveling, filming, interacting with enough people over 24 cities, the simplest and most literal indicator of accessibility has been the wheelchair ramp. Think about it. A wheelchair ramp allows you access. Usually, access is needed to overcome a barrier or an obstacle. For example, a set of stairs, a sidewalk or pavement ledge, or the threshold to a door entrance. As a wheelchair user, my obstacles come in all shapes and forms. Besides accessing locations, I sometimes need to maneuver into them, like a toilet stall large enough to accommodate both me and my wheelchair. As someone who has spent a lifetime eye level with people's bums, waists, and crotches, I need to be able to access everything that they can easily reach, like light switches and elevator buttons, to bathroom faucets and even toilet flushes. I can only travel long distances if my means of transport is accessible. And of course, trying to access different ways of thinking and perceptions toward my disability require much more complicated means than just a ramp. Our guy on the wheelchair then probably rolled into the bar via an accessible entrance, which means he used a ramp of some sort. But now we must figure out which entrance did he actually use to enter the bar. I mean, he could pop in from an entrance from the loading areas following the liquor trolleys, been there. Or he could have traversed his way from the maze of a bustling kitchen, been there as well. I have accessed many an indoor and outdoor location from the strangest of accessible entrances, from livestock delivery to maintenance equipment, while the actual entrances to the business, leisure or medical facility continued to serve an able-bodied community. That was my aha moment. Merely gaining access to something and being able to overcome barriers more often ends up excluding you from everyday experiences. Accessible doesn't mean inclusive, and inclusive means something very different than what you think or what I used to think. For example, entering a store via a ramp at the main entrance used by all customers, accessible and inclusive. Using a ramp at the side entrance built specifically for wheelchair users, not quite inclusive, is it? Once you notice the various forms of accessibility, you begin to see examples of inclusion and inclusive design at work, or the lack of inclusive design. The stick figure wheelchair symbol, which denotes access points across the world via placards and door signs, does not really include all the other disability types, does it? Inclusion focuses on the specifics, addressing issues that arise not just in limitations, but also in thought processes, cultural barriers, and society at large. I have frequented malls and multiple screen cinemas since they cropped up in Mumbai in the mid-2000s. The elevators had signs on each level of those buildings in multiple languages, requesting priority for senior citizens, people with disabilities, pregnant women, and those with prams or strollers. Today, a few faint outlines of those placards are visible after they were removed. Aha, again, inclusion cannot be enforced. It has to become a way of life. For true inclusion, able, disabled need to come together in everyday life. The disabled in many countries, and here in India, say, how can you expect us to become a part of mainstream society when we are not even provided with basic accessible infrastructure? A lot of the able-bodied and powers responsible for such infrastructure say, even the few existing accessible structures and facility don't see much action because the disabled aren't really visible or venture out of their homes. Often, the example cited for ideal disability assimilation into mainstream society seems to be Western Europe or USA, Australia, and closer to home, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and the rich Middle Eastern countries. Yet, here I am, one Indian out of 6 million individuals with a movement disorder, out of 21 million Indians with all other disabilities combined. Officially speaking, of course. I was the only student with a disability out of 4,000 others in my 12 years of schooling. I made it through 6 years of college as the only student on a manual wheelchair, physically carried and pushed from lecture hall to lecture hall, upstairs and down them, never ever knowing where the toilets were, because not only was accessibility an alien concept, but my disability in that ecosystem made me an extremely rare species. I had great able-bodied friends, a busy academic life, hired help to carry me wherever I wish. And that level of acceptance was a great camouflage to ensure my survival in a non-inclusive, inaccessible Mumbai of the 80s and 90s. Here is the thing about growing in an ecosystem. You can only grow if you interact and contribute. I played the role of a sedentary rock, never letting things affect me, never questioning, never reaching out to seek my own kind, curious about their lives. My choice of further studies plucked me from my world of acceptance and dropped me into one of overabundance. In Mumbai, I was sedentary. As a film student in San Francisco, I became electric. Literally, I transitioned to a power wheelchair and could travel solo by any means of transportation I fancied. Buses, trains, trams, vans, cars, boats, and even an accessible golf cart. Making films with my fellow students, I was expected to contribute equally as a professional and not a person with a disability. Mumbai is where I was born and raised, but San Francisco is where I learned to live. In 5 years, I was able to do the simplest of things that I had never been able to achieve on my own in Mumbai. Rolling for hours on sidewalks, being a pedestrian, sitting right at the ocean's edge to catch a sunset, taking a play, a movie, concert, or an art festival with hundreds of other people. The most amazing experience in all those years? Meeting other wheelchair users on a regular basis, guys who rolled into bars for drinks and girls who took their wheelchair fashion sense as seriously as their winning attitudes towards life. I returned to Mumbai a changed man. And then I found the city had changed as well. Signs of accessibility had bloomed with swanky new malls, and seafront sidewalks bore a new, smoothly paved, wheelchair-friendly look, and I was able to convert my van into an accessible one with heavy ramps but still practical enough to afford me long-distance freedom on my electric wheelchair. In its haste to implement accessibility, the city had never considered inclusivity or inclusive design aspects. Bizarre, steeply curved ramps with slippery smooth surfaces, toilets with wide inviting doorways but walk-in size stalls, and elevators with easily reachable call buttons that would exit you out into narrow hallways where turning your chair was not possible. Special needs staff would look quizzically at me if I inquire about accessibility, ramps, or the nearest wheelchair-friendly toilet. To my newly conditioned, inclusivity-tuned mind, this was unbearable. So I did what best came to me. I ranted like a 3-year-old, hoping everyone would listen. Now, these were days before social media and instant messaging. So with the powerful fourth estate of newspaper journalism, I focused on all the things I thought were wrong. People who mattered had more urgent priorities to address for the disabled. And people who lent an ear did it out of sympathy more than a true sense of what I was talking about, having no real-life experiences to relate with. I had gone from one extreme of the Mumbai disability ecosystem to another, tolerance for everything had given way to hostile criticism without solutions in sight. And then inclusion took a backseat to my career. I wrote screenplays, made movies, and collaborated only with people who knew me and valued my skills. Even within my profession, I became that wheelchair guy, more a liability than an asset. I ran out of all hostility when I met a very naive special needs representative who had 24 different ways to say how he was an expert with the differently abled and their needs. Despite finding it hilarious, we actually communicated. Animatedly and amicably, we arrived at a mutual solution to the parking issue I faced. Aha! The third, and the most valuable one. The next day, I wrote a newspaper article about the term differently abled and other labels which often confuse and lead to a disconnect with society. The newspaper wrote back and asked me to share more of my views as a Mumbai guy on wheels. For the first time, I did not communicate anger. I communicated challenges, fears, frustrations, joy, laughter, sex, all things everyone faces in their lives, disabled or otherwise. For 10 weeks, I wrote. And finally, people wrote back. Various disabled across India identified with my life and shared theirs with me. When faced with inaccessibility, I chose dialogue over complaint, putting my wheels in their shoes, so to speak. New work possibilities presented themselves. A huge travel company entrusted me to create a travel platform for people with all kinds of disabilities. I traveled to 5 different countries and more than a dozen international cities in a span of 2 years. I participated in international panels with change makers and innovators in the disabled world. I've also been surprised at the lack of inaccessibility in the most unexpected of advanced countries. But most importantly, I continue to share my life in its own disability ecosystem with others. My home, my workplace, every place I experience, my family, friends, co-workers, clients are all part of my micro-disability ecosystem. With social media, search engines, mapping applications, we share this information with the world around us. I know several wheelchair users now and folk with other disabilities who share their ecosystems too. Para-athletes, motivational speakers, accessibility experts, entrepreneurs, models, content creators, and their immediate able-bodied kin can very much make inclusivity a very real possibility and mainstream integration a common facet of life. Mumbai raised me. San Francisco taught me how to live. But Mumbai is where I could take those lessons and put them all to good use in the most inclusive way possible. And if it helps me get a guy on a wheelchair into a bar, well, my job is done. Speaking of which, a guy on a wheelchair rolls in through the front door of a bar and the bartender says to him, "Is this going to be a terrible joke about inclusivity?" The guy replies, "I definitely can't stand for such nonsense, but we better ask the blind guy if he sees it that way, or if the deaf guy has to say something about it." Well, thank you for having me. Long days, pleasant nights.